Nathan, thank you for coming in and working on this pre-observation form with me. Looking forward to an observation cycle with you. Why don't you just start off, tell me a little bit about what your class looks like and some of the needs of that class.
Okay, so it's 26 7th graders. It's fairly 504 IEP heavy. This is the first year that we've combined all of the 7th grade. We used to have a section of each. And so this is the first year we've done that, where we've combined them. And so they're a little bit crammed in the classroom as far as spacing goes. Not that the size of the class is too big, because I've taught bigger classes elsewhere in student teaching, but just for that size of room, it's a little bit confining.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. What are some of the special needs of students in that class?
As far as IEP and 504 goes, time out of class to work in a quiet environment, reduction of assignments. What was the other one? Would be taking tests and homework in a quiet environment, eliminating answers, but most of them are reading, which directly correlates to social studies, but reading and mathematics goals, and then a few behaviorals.
So when I come in tomorrow, what am I going to be observing for this class?
So we're doing a lecture on World War I. So we've been going through the modern history of Europe as part of our Eastern Hemisphere Studies class, and so it's not going to be super in-depth because we have a year to get through the whole of the Eastern Hemisphere. And so right now we have gotten to the point where we're talking about World War I, and so we're going to do this, get through the war, and then the signing of the armistice. Not sure if we're going to get through all of that on that day, but the hope is we get through as much of it as we can, and then we'll do some assignments to go with it, and then eventually a quiz.
Okay, when you think about this lesson, Nathan, how do you feel like it supports your goals as a teacher? How does it hit the state guidelines and our district goals? And you can break that up into different, we can, take that one at a time if you want.
Okay. So as far as meeting the state guidelines, it meets the requirements of what we are required to teach. District has broken up classes into these specific classes and wants us to cover a variety of subjects within. So as a social studies teacher, it's not quite like, as I see it, as like math, where you're teaching, we're going to do fractions, and then we're moving on to decimals, and then we're moving on to this. It'd be more like language arts, or possibly family consumer science, where you're hitting the same sorts of things through different topics. And so at any given lesson, you're essentially meeting like 8 different standards, because you're talking about the economics and the political and the social and the human interaction and the environmental impact and all that sort of stuff that goes with that.
And I think you bring up a great point, especially in social studies, that your content is always kind of interwoven through, that history, and then it comes back and you'll see some similarities in that they can refer back to as students. How do you plan to assess their achievement? Are you meeting your goal with your students?
So as we're going through the lecture, we're going to be doing a simplified Socratic method, where it's going to be question and answers we're going through. When we get done, they're going to have a question posted on the assignment on Google Classroom that's going to ask 3 key things about World War I. Like, when did it start, or not when did it start, why did it start? What are some of the new innovations of World War I? So talking about like technologies and what made it so terrible of a war, outside of previous wars, outside of the Civil War. And then why did it end, and what was the problem with its ending? Then we're going to do a couple assignments, like where the kids are taking on the heavy lifting and doing the learning about World War I that will reinforce that learning. And then we're going to have a quiz over not necessarily just World War I, but World War I, the rise of nationalism, and probably going into the Great Depression.
How does it work in your class when you're you come forward with a topic or part of this, and you just feel like, they're just not, they're not getting it, or they're just kind of sitting there. How do you engage your students in situations like that?
Well, generally, the question and answer, so it seems like it's a hard thing to do because sometimes kids just don't seem to understand what you're putting down, and so you have to just continuously ask the question in a different way, or you give a little clues, and then generally when one kid gets success, and I try not, like, there's always, 2 or 3 kids that are always engaged, right? And that seems to be a fair statement across the board for any class. And you try not to call on them every time. And when the class seems to not be engaged, you especially try not to call on them, because you want to get that kid that's sitting in the back that's not engaged. You call on them, ask the question, give them some time to think about it, and then call on them, and kind of, you almost drag it out of them a little bit. And so then once they get a little bit successful, then they're going to be more apt to answer more questions. It instills that engagement, because a lot of kids, I feel like they don't want to engage because they don't feel successful, right? Or they give up on the content before they even start, because it's easier to give up than it is to fail, right? And so if you can get that kid that first win, then they're more apt to do it. So like, say that, I'm the class clown that doesn't want to engage, but I answer the question, well, now John is going to answer the next question and be more apt, even though he wasn't necessarily engaged, or Susie, or whoever the case may be.
I think that's a great comment. I think that leads to one of the things that I like is the growth mindset of, you give the chance to succeed, but not necessarily they can fail, but still come back around and learn from that, and continue to grow on from that.
Well, I say, and one of the things in answering questions, when kids are answering questions, I try not to do. Sometimes you're in such a push that you sort of, no, that's incorrect. But generally you try to be like, all right, well, you're partially correct, and here's where you're right. Now can somebody build on it, right? So it's not just completely shutting somebody down, like, oh, you're an idiot, you know nothing, kind of stuff. It's, hey, you're getting close, you're almost there, and either you build on it, or hey, I got part of it right, now John, finish it off, right?
Yeah, and that lends to kind of that group concept, that group learn and that group speak, where they can all find success in that. As you've taught this before, which you have, what have been some of the difficulties that you try to work around in your class with this material?
Well, some of it's just the speed at which we have to go, because it is a lot of content for a year, right? I find since I started teaching, it seems like let's use U.S. history as an example, or actually let's do the same class, Eastern Hemisphere. So I usually go Europe, Africa, Asia, and then down into Oceania, Australia. And by the time I get to Oceania, Australia, I'm only getting like halfway through Oceania, Australia. And so trying to push so much content out and then have the kids able to actually absorb said content is a really big challenge. The other is with like classroom management, especially in a lecture setting, when you're doing direct instruction, trying to keep kids engaged, keep them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then it's been a real struggle with this class specifically throughout the year. So we'll see how they do.
Yeah. What are the instructional materials you plan to use in class?
Okay, 2 years ago we adopted HMH for our social studies curriculum, and so I started using their lecture slides. They're pretty well put together. They've got the information I want, and that way I know they're aligned with standards. I know that Kyle at the high school is using the same material, and so it creates a consistency for lecture-wise. So I'm not, like, I'll still use my own assignments and stuff like that outside of lecture, but for this I'll be using like an HMH lecture, my board, Google Classroom. I will generate the questions, and then a few assignments after the fact that I will put together.
And HMH, is that Her Majesty's History? Is that where that?
No, I can't remember what it stands for. HMH Co.
That reminds me of a ship that they have.
Yeah.
We talked about in our district we're working on standards and including that, aligning our are teaching to that? What standards are you aligning this lesson with?
Let's see. So, are you meaning like what standards in specific? Or
Yeah,
what
one
standards?
as you have filled out this out, like you've mentioned criteria one, and then or you have standard one, criteria
Yeah.
A and E, and I think that's the enhancing academic performance.
Yeah.
Which that's an obvious one, and also I think you mentioned earlier that this meets our district goals
Yeah.
for.
For what we need to meet as far as, so, yeah, I mean, I'd be meeting, the state and local standards. And then also it's aligned with those, what is required through those. And then, yeah, the teaching standards, you'd have the enhancing academic performance meeting district goals, right? But you also have, I think, the differentiated learning opportunities. And so, like when I was in college, it was essentially all stage on a stage, right? You know, direct instruction, professor sits up there, which is fine for college because, you know, I wanted to be there. These are the classes I'm taking because I'm interested in them. Not necessarily the case, especially in K-12, right? Like a lot of kids are going to be interested in social studies, but, you know, maybe not necessarily on that day or in general. And so, with this, I'm doing lecture, but then I'm also going to do more hands-on assignment where they're doing the research and filling stuff out. We also do projects and presentations and things like that. And so I think combining like a lecture with all of that, we're hitting some of the same points and some of the same key learning parts through that differentiated instruction.
Thank you. As we have been visiting, kind of leading up to this observation and some of the things that, you know, in this cycle, and you and I visited some of my when I dropped by and observed. I appreciate. I want you to know. Lots of times in observation, it's easy to pick one of your easy classes where the kids will all just align and do what you want them to do. So I really appreciate that you're picking. I mean, we've noted in school that the 7th grade classes can get pretty gnarly at some point in class, and
It's a struggling class.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you stepping forward and choosing this class that for us to look at, and I'm hopeful that I know that you do a great job, and we'll look at it, and it'll be an interesting process to go through and see these kids in action.
Yeah.
I appreciate your time.
Yep,
We'll
no
look
problem.
forward to our observation.
Yep, look forward to it.